Hello everyone, and welcome to this Smart Policing Initiative webinar on United Kingdom models of policing in SPI. I'm going to pass things over to our project director, Chip Coldren, to introduce our webinar and our presenters.
Thank you, Zoe. Can everybody or somebody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Welcome to the Smart Policing Initiative webinar on policing models in the United Kingdom that smart policing sites are adopting, or maybe better to say adapting. This is one of a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA, the technical assistance and training provider for the Smart Policing Initiative. Our policy advisor from BJA, Kate McNamee, suggested this webinar topic. She noticed that several of our smart policing sites have implemented police practices and crime prevention models from the UK, or plan to, and thought it would be interesting to explore this link further. She unfortunately cannot join us at this webinar today, or she would have said a few words and she would have thanked our participants and our presenters profusely for putting the effort into this webinar. Julie Wartell is our main facilitator today. She is a subject matter expert with the Smart Policing Initiative and has worked with a number of sites over the past few years, including several that have adopted UK models. Interestingly, she recently received a diploma in applied criminology from Cambridge University, so she has that connection to the UK as well. In addition to her work with smart policing, Julie has been involved with crime analysis, mapping, problem-oriented policing, among other things, in what has been a very productive career. We're proud to have her working with us on smart policing. Julie is joined by representatives from several smart policing sites who will discuss their particular initiatives. Desiree DeSault from Boston, Deborah Weisel from the Chula Vista, California initiative, Kevin Thomas from Philadelphia, and Scott Wolf from Columbia, South Carolina. We thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its long-standing support. They don't just support smart policing, they are true champions of the initiative. And we thank Julie, her co-presenters, and the staff from CNA for the effort in putting this webinar together. I'm confident you will learn something interesting about the healthy connection between smart policing and what we are learning about business practices and crime prevention approaches in the UK. Permit me to make a few other comments and we'll proceed to the webinar. This webinar is recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later on our website. At the end of each site's presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions or comments. So please speak up when the opportunity presents itself. Others on the webinar will be interested in what you have to say. You will see that there's a chat capability with the WebEx program, so you can also share your comments and questions with the presenters and others on the webinar as we proceed. Immediately following the webinar, you will receive a request to evaluate it. Please complete the evaluation and please give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. Now let me ask Julie to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Chip, and welcome everyone. As Chip said, I'm honored to be here coordinating such a group, and we will proceed. If I can figure out the computer, we will proceed. There we go. So for those of you not familiar with where the United Kingdom is, we have a map for you. So the United Kingdom coming over to the United States. And a little history on what policing was in the United Kingdom and the types of vehicles that they drive. Fortunately, we did not adopt that part of the UK model in policing. And all the way into the United States, we have UK police officers marching on the Brooklyn Bridge after 9/11. So in 1829, Sir Robert Peel's 9 principles of policing were developed and provided to all officers of England's Metropolitan Police Force. I remember in the 1990s, as we promoted problem-solving and neighborhood policing, hearing one of the principles, the police are the public and the public are the police. I heard that over and over again. In other words, there's a long history in the UK of progressive policing strategies and approaches. Police agencies in the United States have been gaining knowledge and adopting these models ever since. Why the UK? Not only is the UK a reasonable distance away, especially for our colleagues on the East Coast, as you'll hear from 3 of the 4 are on the East Coast. But similar societal factors and language also make it a country that is conducive for replication. Additionally, there is a large body of evidence that has come out of the UK, from the Home Office to policing-related publications, journals, books, etc., to conferences and many other international exchanges. During the webinar today are examples of how 4 SPI sites are using a variety of UK models in their efforts, as Chip mentioned. So who we will hear from today, and again, a map because I like maps. We are the Boston Police Department, which will talk about homicide investigation, and Boston Police Department Policy Analyst Desiree Dassault will discuss why they chose the UK model, that they brought in an advisor from the UK Police, they've used their manual, attended training, and then talk about aspects that Boston has adopted and the impact that it's had. The Philadelphia Police Department is represented by the Director of Research and Analysis, Kevin Thomas. He will discuss SPI initial projects, moving towards organizational change, and how they have enhanced crime and strategic analysis, centralized their data, and integrated it into their area planning processes. Columbia, South Carolina will also discuss the adoption of the National Intelligence Model. They have moved to intelligence-led policing based on this approach, and we'll discuss how, and that, is Scott Wolf from the University of South Carolina and the research partner for Columbia. And Scott will discuss how it relates to 2 Columbia projects, repeat burglaries and gang analysis, and how they're embedding the National Intelligence Model department-wide. Chula Vista over on the West Coast, down in San Diego County, is a different approach that they've adopted, and that's the graded response to domestic violence. So Deborah Weissel, who is from North Carolina State and Chula Vista's research partner, will discuss the UK repeat victimization studies, West Yorkshire's approach to domestic violence, and then how that's being adopted into Chula Vista's approach. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Desiree.
Thanks, Julie. Is that working now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Hi, my name is Desiree. I'm a policy analyst at the Boston Police Department and the project coordinator for the Boston Police Smart Policing Initiative, which is focusing on homicide investigations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the UK influence that we've done within our project and in our homicide response. Just to give you some background on where we are in our project, we are currently in our 4th year of funding, and our research partner, Dr. Anthony Braga, is currently working on the evaluation of the project. We have just completed a 2-year implementation phase and are working on creating a final report. The goal of our project is to improve homicide clearance rates. Boston was at a 40% clearance rate in 2011, whereas the national average was at 60%. In order to do so, we identified cities with above average clearance rates to research for best practices and suggested models. One of our main models and approaches was the UK model, which exemplified close to 100% clearance rate, a considerable use of forensics, and a structured response. At the time of program creation, the Boston Police Commissioner was very interested in the resource-driven and structured investigations at scene and throughout the investigation in the United Kingdom. There was interest in seeing if utilizing UK model protocols and more structure to each investigation in Boston would increase the solvability of cases. In the 1990s, police forces in the UK had been required to focus on and improve the performance of their investigations for clearing homicides. To do so, they developed investigative accountability structures, enhanced investigator training, and professionalized the investigative process. Some of these key aspects impressed the administration. This includes the accountability of the senior investigator officer, which would be a detective supervisor in our world, their documentation, and the elements of investigative strategies, such as a focus on forensic resources, on-scene management teams, homicide reviews, and enhanced training. Knowing that we wanted to move our homicide investigations in this direction and to better understand the UK model, the Boston Police Department participated in some unique activities, one being the hiring of a UK advisor, and the other was sending 2 top officials for a 3-week training in England. The Boston Police Department hired UK Detective Chief Superintendent Mark Warwick to teach us the background of the system overseas and assist in the adaptation of key elements. The Boston Police Department and Mark Warwick identified and defined complementary investigative structures and processes that would meet both the BPD and U.S. legal requirements. Mr. Warwick visited quarterly to assist in setting up the project. He met with officials to articulate why the department was looking at these processes abroad and the methods behind them, as well as to gain some interest in the new models. As one can expect, these changes were met with some pushback from all levels and the unions, so providing as much information and making personnel a key part was very important in our process, and having Mark on hand to explain the differences between the culture and legal requirements really helped drive the purpose of our method and the reasoning behind the UK model to our own detectives and our own investigators. Additionally, Boston sent 2 of our commanders in our Bureau of Investigative Services to Coventry, England, to partake in a 3-week case-based course. This course, also known as Senior Investigating Officer Training, covered formal accreditation and competency processes for investigators of all ranks, forensic management, capability and capacity issues, and the structure of investigative data processes. Some of the key areas that interested the command staff that attended and were brought back to incorporate included an analyst role, crime scene security and evidence, training consistency, maximizing the benefits from forensic processes at the scene to the submission management, and training doctrine and processes. In addition to these key features that were brought back from the training, there were key influences in all manners of the investigations from the UK model. One of the main features of the training was the use of management teams to target investigative problems. The composition of the management team is, to a large extent, the individuals that respond to homicides with selective responsibilities. In an attempt to gain insight and gain support, Boston set up an advisory committee to examine these roles and identify possible gaps. These individuals represented those that managed different aspects from first officer on scene to homicide investigator. Based on feedback and based on UK influence, each role was addressed with new protocols. These protocols were issued in November 2012. Rule changes and process changes are quite difficult in our labor and union-driven department, so these processes that drew from the UK model, other cities, and internal best practices were created and issued through a commissioner's memorandum. This memorandum created protocols such as formal designation of an entry log scribe, canvas supervisor role for house-to-house searches and for witness identification, formal witness identification and documentation, department-wide understanding and utilization of all of our forensic groups, pre-scene and post-scene briefings after and before every scene with forensic group units as well as others on scene, and a standard utilization of a homicide data analyst. The use of the analysts seems to be universally accepted, but the UK holds them at a very high regard, and was necessary for us to incorporate the high-level and dedicated intelligence aspects of the UK model. Through funding and through our UK advisors' suggestions, we've spent much time identifying the individual's role and incorporating them within our homicide unit. This analyst assists investigators in creating links such as social networks, phone record links, and other information that otherwise could be missed without these dedicated resources. This added resource has been received very favorably in our homicide unit. We also focused on the homicide, considered the murder manual in the UK and a homicide practice guide in Boston. The UK follows extensive checklists for every aspect of an investigation and documents every key action and decision made. In Boston, we adapted this to create documentation in the form of checklists for all homicide detective supervisors, patrol supervisors, and as well as a crime scene entry log that every scene consists of. These are used as reminders and to create consistency for all those who respond to homicide scenes. Impact. So the use of these protocols have been very much ongoing, but for study purposes, we actually concluded the implementation of these checklists and protocols in November 2014, just the analysis portion of it. This evaluation is still ongoing, but leading up to this, key elements of the analytic work for investigative practices have been identified. These include the analysis of clearance rates for particular types of homicides, the analysis of witness identification and cooperation and how it impacts homicide investigations, the analysis of the amount of evidence collected and the value of the evidence collected, the use of our forensic units and at what points they lead to clearances versus or lead to the investigative strategy, and the use of intelligence analysis in these investigations. We were recently awarded supplemental funding to continue and finalize this work, as well as continue similar research capacity or research efforts in non-fatal shooting investigations. So while there's no direct tie to, well, we don't have a direct link to the homicide clearances just yet. The evaluation that Dr. Braga is working on will hopefully just, at least show the differences between the work that we've been doing versus the previous years. And we will also be doing a quasi-experimental analysis of clearance rates in comparison cities to see whether there's any impacts compared to the other cities based on their clearance rates. And this last slide is just a summary of some of the changes that took place based on the UK influence. These include increased and appropriately used resources, business model based on best practices, and a standardized and consistent system of homicide response that demands accountability and sustainability, and the increased coordination and communication of all units. Any questions?
Hi, this is Deborah Lamb-Weissel at North Carolina Central University, working with the Chula Vista, California Police Department on repeat victimization and domestic violence. I'm the research partner for the police department. We got our start in our SPI grant just about a year ago now, so it's been a very busy period of time. But we originally started working on this problem because of concern about domestic violence in the city of Chula Vista. Overall, among all the calls to police, domestic violence was the #2 most common call for service, and it wasn't declining in contrast to other types of calls. Now, when I talk about domestic violence, many people think you're talking about domestic violence assaults or batteries, but we're looking both at crimes and non-crime calls. Really, about 2/3 of all the domestic violence calls in Chula Vista are non-crime calls. They're a verbal argument or dispute of some kind that gets a 911 call to the police department. So we're trying to distinguish this, but a big part of what we're finding is that many of our repeat verbal-only calls may be DV, but we're trying to examine that further at this point. We're just still working on our analysis now. When we look at our preliminary data, we found that about 1/4 of all our residential addresses with domestic violence account for 50% of all DV calls for service. So already we know it's a big chunk that can be explained by the repeat calls for that particular crime type. In getting started with our work, we really were drawn to build on some of the work that had been done on repeat victimization and domestic violence in the United Kingdom. Many of you may be familiar that in the mid-90s, almost 20 years ago, the Home Office established repeat victimization as a performance indicator for police. In other words, police were routinely evaluated if they were going back to deal with the same problems again and again. A lot of that performance indicator drew from the work in Huddersfield in the UK. They examined the problem of what they call domestic burglary, I'd call residential burglary or house burglary, and car crime, and developed a graded response, meaning that the type of response implemented depended on how many prior offenses had occurred. That work in Huddersfield was done in 1994, and if you want to take a look at it, you can look at crimesolutions.gov. It's one of the projects rated as effective, so we want to build on their accomplishments there. In terms of domestic violence, both Merseyside and the West Yorkshire police looked at domestic violence specifically. Merseyside initially found that a third of all the domestic violence calls were repeat calls to the same address within 1 year period of time, quite a compelling proportion of calls, and that most of these calls, a third of them, recurred within 5 weeks. So within 5 weeks, the second call after initial call came into the police. There wasn't an implementation of response treatment done, but that study was replicated somewhat in West Yorkshire Police, a large police agency, and the Killingbeck Division in 1997 developed a specific graded response using the Huddersfield approach and the Merseyside focus on repeat victimization. In West Yorkshire, as you'll see on our screen here, they develop a response, what I call a dose of treatment from the police, depending upon the number of prior calls to the police or the seriousness of the offense. That was really equally focused on both the victim and offender. Both got a treatment or a dose of police based on which call type had occurred. And the responses varied from, first of all, letting both the victim and offender notify them about the pro-arrest approach of the police department, warning them, providing them information. They provided them with increased police contacts, and they also monitored jail release for a pretrial jail release, depending upon the level of offense that the offender was engaged in, and kept the victims well informed about this all along throughout the process. You can look on the UK's website and see, I think they have a real easy to look at diagram of how they implemented their level of treatment, level 1 for first offense call, and focus on both the perpetrator or the suspect and the victim. Now the middle column here on the slide that looks at the common law offenses, those are predominantly non-crime calls, what would be called breach of peace, like a disturbance, but an arrest was typically not appropriate for these common law offenses. In the far right-hand column, you'll see criminal offenses. So this equates to what we're looking at in Chula Vista with non-crime verbal calls for offenders, what we might do, and the criminal offenses where a DB crime has actually occurred. And we think that distinction is quite important in Chula Vista. In West Yorkshire, they had some amazing results because overall the repeat calls dropped from over a third of all calls initially to 15% of all domestic violence calls. And they found that their intervention at the earliest incident, that initial call to the police, was the most effective in preventing a repeat call to the police. They also had another impact that was not just to reduce repeat calls, but it increased the time between calls. I mentioned earlier that a third recurred within 5 weeks of time, and they found that they were able to increase the time between an initial call and a repeat call. By the end of the project, nearly 50% of the offenders could go a year without reoffending or having a repeat call to the police. And importantly, they reduced the chronic repeat offenders, so the more serious crime calls dropped from 34% to over 2% of the total. Now, note their call volume was steady. Overall calls to the police did not decline, but West Yorkshire attributed that to increased reporting of less serious offenses, the non-crime calls by victims. In Chula Vista, we're doing a bit of a hybrid approach as part of our SPI project starting in July 1 this year as we continue to work on our analysis. We're using the West Yorkshire tiered response model based on the number of prior calls for service and the severity. But we're also implementing what you might know from the High Point, North Carolina, their focused deterrence model in terms of warning and more strategic focus on the more chronic offenders. We're also following up a little bit with what Fremont, California did in their study quite a few years ago, was an in-person follow-up with offenders and victims. At 7 and 28 days they did in Fremont, California. We're trying to identify what's the right time frame to do a follow-up with offenders when they might be most willing to take that message about not re-offending based on a prior issue that had occurred. Our greater response, what our police officers will do, will be based on our extensive problem analysis. We're enhancing our repeat victimization analysis. In West Yorkshire, they only focused on repeat addresses and male offenders. We're looking at not only the same addresses recurring, but also how repeat victims and repeat offenders play into and contribute to the repeat locations in the city of Chula Vista. We haven't quite determined how all that interaction will occur, but we're working on that now. So we look forward to learning more about this and following the guidance from the Brits, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you'd like to pose.
Yeah, Deborah, this is... Oh,
Sorry, we actually have questions in the Boston presentation, so I was going to go ahead and do that one first, and then we can get back to the second one. So, Errol Edding, you can unmute your line by pressing #6 and ask your question for the Boston presenter.
Yeah, hi, this is Errol Edding. I was just wondering if how this might have affected with dealing with the prosecutor. Were there any lessons learned from the UK that were applied to the Boston experiment to, that changed relationships or practices with the prosecutor for, I guess it's Suffolk County, I'm not sure, for Boston?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, Suffolk County, we actually have a unique position where our Suffolk County District Attorney's Office actually is in charge of our homicide unit, so we report directly to them. So they were brought in pretty early on the research part of this, understanding what we'd be looking at. But as we implemented these protocols, we worked hand in hand with the DA's office. Our UK consultant actually found the relationship pretty unique. Over there, it's very, it's a national practice over there, so seeing the way that different units work separately and working for the DA directly, he was very adaptable to that and helped us to navigate through the UK model to incorporate the changes that we could with the permission of the DA's office. And they actually became pretty excited about the idea of a checklist, just because I think it makes their lives a little bit easier as well in prosecuting and understanding what steps the detectives are taking on scene.
Thank you.
And then, Greg, I think that was you who just wanted to ask Deborah a question. You can go ahead now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Deborah, I had a question about, it also has to do with prosecutions. Here in Shawnee, Kansas, our domestic violence are prosecuted through the district attorney's office at the county level. Does Chula Vista, do they prosecute their own domestic violence, misdemeanor batteries, and misdemeanor crimes?
No, they don't. And we work with the San Diego District Attorney's Office, which we have a very capable representation of that, with Julie Wartell on the line, since she works with the San Diego District Attorney's Office as one of her positions. But the police department wouldn't do that individually. They would submit that arrest or charge to DA for a review before they would issue on that case. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and the reason I'm asking is we have a very good prosecution and victim-centric response to domestic violence here. We do lethality assessments, and we offer safe home services to victims and we actually dial the phone for them when they show to be high risk. But again, it's all victim-centric, and I like the approach that you're taking with the focused deterrence and looking at offenders. One thing that I've heard recently and wondered if you had any insight into this is that pro-arrest policies tend to have the best effect on people who are employed and that sort of thing. Have you heard anything like that?
Well, the research certainly has examined that issue, over the years, and we are looking at that too. However, again, nearly 2/3 of these calls aren't crimes; they're just, verbal disturbances. So we're trying to look on the end of the frequent, call as well as the more severe offenses and arrest.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to be watching what you folks are doing really closely, because in the last year we've had, it seems like our domestic violence just continues to escalate, and we've had situations where it seems as though the participants on both sides try to use the police as a means of getting to the other person as well, because at times they're listed as suspects, as times they're listed as victims, and it just keeps going back and forth.
That's why we think looking at locations, victims, and offenders, and the switch hitters when they change their role, the interaction of that over time, we think we'll be able to disentangle some of those factors.
Oh, that'd be great. So I think for the coming year, we're going to be focusing on ways to try and reduce our domestic violence calls too. And so I appreciate that. And like I said, we'll be keeping an eye on the SPI website for any updates that you folks post there.
Well, keep us posted about your work as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions for Deborah or for Desiree? All right, then I'm going to pass it along to Kevin Thomas from Philadelphia. Kevin, you are still muted. There you go.
Hello, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you very much. Hello. My name is Kevin Thomas. I'm the Director of Research and Analysis at the Philadelphia Police Department. We are also on our third round of smart policing, of being part of the smart policing initiative. I'm going to see if I can't figure out how to use this thing. There we go. All right. So I have a misnomer here in the first bullet. The original Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment, which was done in conjunction with Philadelphia Police and Temple University, specifically Jerry Ratcliffe and Elizabeth Groff. That was not part of the Smart Policing Initiative, but it was done independently. What that basically was one of the first steps for Philadelphia to begin the idea of actually testing what was known, testing actual hypotheses that the department had. One of those at that time was that foot beats did not work. So they designed a research study across just about all 21 of the districts, and they actually found the results of that were that there was actually a 23% reduction in violent crime within those foot beat areas across the board. I think that was a really big eye-opener for much of the command, realizing that opening up this idea that we need to be more evidence-driven and look at and question our assumptions a bit deeper. So with our first round of SMART funding, we actually went in and began testing. We did a three-pronged test. One, testing foot patrol again, looking at a problem-solving approach, and looking at offender-focused strategies. That was also with Jerry Ratcliffe, Liz Groth, and Temple University. In that, we have some preliminary results back from that. I don't think they have a full paper out. But some of the interesting results is that we were not able to repeat the reduction that we had with the foot patrols in this particular test. We had no reductions whatsoever. We have a couple theories behind why that's the case. In the first round of this, we used rookie officers. In this case, we allowed the captains to choose who they wanted in the foot patrols, and many of which were veteran police officers. Another factor was we did allow for a bit of creativity in terms of where those foot patrol areas would be, and gave more authority to the command staff in those districts. So that meant that some of those areas expanded, or there was less officers. The dosages were less. So what we learned out of that was, number one, having rookie officers in there, that does indeed make a difference. I mean, just the attitude, I hate to use the word aggressiveness, they're just much more motivated, I think, than some of the veterans. And the tendency, the desire to want to expand that foot patrol area, it's tempting when you see a shooting just outside that to maybe expand a grid. You really can't do that. If you're going to hold that area, you got to keep the correct dosage, and you got to keep it nice and tight. What we did find with the offender focus, excuse me while I pull up my notes, was that in comparison to all the other things that we tested in this round, was that it was definitely the most successful. It was the offender focus areas were successful in reducing all violent crimes by 42% compared to the equivalent control areas. So these violent incidents included homicide, robbery, assaults, both aggravated and misdemeanor. And the offender focus sites were even more effective on violent felonies, reducing them by 50% compared to the rest of the control areas. So that was very positive. On the problem-solving side, it was somewhat inconclusive. It became mostly, I think what happened was it became mostly focused on quality of life issues instead, sort of speaking to the communities, finding out within those public safety areas what their issues were, and that made these a little bit more difficult to measure, but some of that will be coming out, I think, from Temple later on. Let me move on here. So moving to an organizational change model. So I think it would be difficult for us to say that we've fully adopted the UK NIM approach to policing, but I think it's fair to say that we've been inspired by that. So that inspiration led us to try to do our best to integrate with existing operational strategies and documentation. So those things meant ComStat, or what we call now our crime briefing process, the police service area plans. Now, traditionally, prior to this administration in 2008, we had much smaller sectors. These were much more larger areas, about maybe 3 to 4 per district, and commanded by a lieutenant. And then we're beginning to just bring in the ComStat into these quarterly briefings as well, and make them more of a strategic conversation as opposed to just saying numbers up, numbers down. Part of our second round of SMART funding was enhancing and embedding crime analysis capability. So that meant the training of 26 officers in 21 districts. It was pretty intensive. It involved also Temple University. They did a week of crime science, a couple days of Excel, and a week worth of ArcGIS exposure. Now, anybody who's been, and some of them, they were chosen by their captains just because they happened to have been, you know, they worked the 48 desk and did web form entries, right? So we had various levels of talent, and it was definitely a big ask for them to step into that crime analysis role, but we chose to use the sworn officers just because we felt like it would be that we would get much better adoption in the district, and they would remain under the command of their local captain. And then in addition was this research and analysis unit, which I'm the director of, which largely acts as a support team both in terms of the data analysis, UCR reporting, all that good stuff, and supporting these analysts out in the district. I'm a data guy, so I had to show this slide. I apologize. I hope no one from Philadelphia is on here, but the data management, and this is probably true with most big police departments, but data management was just absolutely atrocious. We're talking about old legacy systems, COBOL stuff, RMS systems that are keeping us back on XP. Independent data access databases from, Access 2000 databases in various units, different standards in different places. It was a mess. So to do any real consistent crime analysis was going to be very difficult. It was a very arduous process. So because of the talents of a bunch of people, namely Grant Irvin and a few others, and a vision of the deputy mayor, they built this public safety GIS system, and within that, they wired up all these systems. So what's happened, because we don't have a true central RMS system, we've created what is basically a spatial data warehouse. And from that, we spin off all kinds of applications, tables, and just that then is sort of the main platform that the non-analysts use, like the lieutenants and the people that don't have access to ARC. The people who do have access to the desktop applications, they connect directly to our data stores. And this is all, at this point, automated at this point. The weekly crime briefing. So as you can see, that in the application, which was built indoors, is now the primary vehicle for which the accountability happens at the crime briefing. And again, you can just see even from some of the logos and stuff that they've put in what we call our war room. I guess now it's called the crime briefing room. Is the mantra coming from command? Is what gets measured gets done. So they can throw on the crime for the 2-week for the ComStaff period. They can bring up the activity. Deputy Commissioner Bethel, who's head of patrol operations on the right, I swear he knows our GIS system better than any of us. And again, this is the fact that we've been able to bring this level of accountability and standardize our data has been probably one of the biggest changes that we've had in Philadelphia. We also had a vision of a PSA planning process. This was the initial vision, which had sort of a 3-month cycle. I mean, I can walk you through it, but the idea being, like, prior to those first 3 months, you know, and before you do your crime audit, you deploy your people to the worst areas. You come up with your action plans. You look at your criminal intelligence, your crime mapping, your temporal analysis, all that good stuff. You reevaluate after 3 months. Strategic tasking group will adapt that PSA action where necessary, and then the strategic tasking group reviews the progress. That was how that was supposed to work. We had a little bit of difficulty with that with some of our existing documentation, which you can see is pretty dated. I know you can't really see anything on this slide, but this was what literally it looked like prior. So in one of our Regional Operations Command South, that chief has taken it upon himself to add another page to this documentation called our page 4. He just calls it page 4. And it's very, very simple, but it's making a very big difference. What we've noticed was that the PSA lieutenants were quite literally they were putting together a PSA plan. Yeah, I went to this community meeting. This is what we're going to monitor. This is what we're going to do. We're not looking at data. Here you go. And the chiefs kept on receiving these reports, and we're sick of it. So they added this page 4, which was going to now require them to identify what their data sets that they're going to use to monitor, what their baseline conditions were, what their current numbers were, what their after implementation was, and their change from baseline. And this has, instead of a 3-month period, this has to go on every month. And even if it's a continuation plan, they continue to monitor it every month. And each PSA can have at least 2 of these going at any one time. The problem, one of the challenges we're having now with this is at a management, is from a management standpoint. If you split Philadelphia in half and you just look at Rock South and those 10 or so districts, we're talking upwards of maybe 70 PSA plans going on at any one given point. And the question is who is monitoring these plans? Who is making sure that, you know, that things are being properly documented and it's the correct data set that you're using to monitor what it is that you're trying to solve. And now moving into the next round of the smart policing, we're looking at hypothesis testing and strategic analysis. So this is, I would say this is more inspired by, excuse me, one second. I got the guy's name over here. You guys all know who he is. I'm the new one, so. Oh, this is all inspired by the sort of Spencer Cheney model, this idea to help commanders and their analysts work together once a priority comes down from the strategic level from the crime briefing. That was a challenge. As soon as a commander had a question and wanted an analysis, then every analyst in the department was doing it. So now it's trying to come up with a true process of how we actually perform that hypothesis testing and who does that work. And then just moving past this, because we know, to actually using data to demonstrate the problem and provide measurable outcomes. And the next, I think the next step, a big press this year is going to be the quarterly briefing. Like as I stated before, traditionally this was crime is up, crime is down, very basic stuff, talking about that previous 3-month period. What they want is higher expectations on and to be more forward thinking. What's going to happen in the next quarter? What's happened in that next quarter over the past 5 years? What are things that are happening in that neighborhood, projects, development projects, this and that may affect crime. So this, and just keeping it short and sweet. I mean, we've literally put together a template that only gives them 4 slides to work with because it became exhaustive. So this again is going to be helped. We're going to get some help from Jerry Ratcliffe and some of the university to try to tune this together and make a much more strategic process and tie that again to the crime briefing, since that seems to be what runs operations. And in terms of the enhancing and embedding the crime analysts, you can see this is one of the officers' products on the left. We trained 26 of them. We held training sessions in our crime analysis lab, and again we provide them access to ArcGIS desktop, I2, basic SQL training. I mean, they get everything through us. And again, here's sort of a map before they're all posted. So any questions?
Any questions from Philadelphia or for Philadelphia? All right, then I'm going to pass it along to Scott Wolf from Columbia.
Great.
All right, thank you, ma'am. See if the slides will advance for me. There we go. Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Scott Wolf. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina and one of the research partners with Columbia, South Carolina Police Department working on their Smart Policing Initiative grant. And so talk a little bit about what we're doing in Columbia today with you all. So the overall purpose of the Columbia SPI project was to improve crime analysis functions within the agency, the intelligence products they were able to produce for the officers in the overall agency, and to move the department towards an intelligence-led policing orientation or philosophy to doing business. And so consistent with everybody that's talked so far today, our project was guided by the UK National Intelligence Model, and if wanted to do with the project, wanted to do was to affect organizational change. And so a good question that could be brought up is, why did we go to the National Intelligence Model as a framework? And so in the initial phases of developing the proposal for the project, we were dealing with an agency by their own admission, right, that had a crime analysis unit and indeed had a great crime analyst, one individual, citizen non-sworn, but in reality the crime analysis unit was only in the agency in name alone, and it wasn't really utilized to any extent by officers of the agency itself. And so the department was looking for a guidepost, an organizational guidepost, for lack of a better term, to at least look as an exemplar to help their agency move more towards an intelligence-led policing philosophy. And so that's why we adopted the National Intelligence Model. And so originally the grant was developed and focused on 2 groups that have been talked about by some of the other cities so far within the agency. The first one being what we call the Strategic Coordinating Group, and that was comprised initially of the assistant chief, deputy chiefs within the department, the crime analyst, and then eventually crime analysts when they hired a second analyst sometime into the grant, and then us from USC as the research partners. And the goal of that Strategic Coordinating Group was to identify and prioritize community problems based on strategic analysis and intelligence products. And so after that group would identify pressing issues that are prioritized, they would task them to the second group, which we termed the Tactical Coordinating Group, consistent with the UK National Intelligence Model. And essentially this was comprised of ad hoc members depending on the problem was to be identified in the Strategic coordinating group. And so, for example, it would be comprised of deputy chiefs of operations, captains of a particular region within the jurisdiction, crime analysts, and then we as the research partners were part of those meetings as well. And so really that was an ad hoc group depending on the problem. And so this organizational structure worked great for 4 to 6 months as the grant period began, but like many other police agencies across the U.S., we faced some pretty significant turnover at the executive level right from the get-go, and we're currently on our third chief since the grant started. And so with that comes turnover within his command staff at each turnover, and so that created a problem with having a consistent strategic coordinating group throughout the grant period. The fortunate thing was that within those first 4 to 6 months, we were able to have really great meetings with the strategic planning group or a coordinating group and identified 2 really pressing issues within the jurisdiction that the agency wanted to tackle and leverage the SPI grant. And so that's what I'll talk about a little bit in more detail in these next couple of slides is our repeat near repeat burglary analysis and initiative and the proliferation of existing gang intelligence as a second project through social network analysis. And so with respect to the first project that has recently become completed and we're in the final analysis and evaluation stage, it was based on an initial strategic level coordinating group meeting analysis of crime hotspots, and we identified significant burglary problems in a particular area of the city referred to as North Region. And so taking it a little bit a step further, kind of leveraging a more of a SARA model to a problem-oriented policing approach, we wanted to dig a little bit more detail about what this burglary problem looked like beyond simply that it was a big hotspot within a particular neighborhood. And so we surveyed the residents, and not surprisingly, burglary was self-reported by residents as one of their primary concerns within their neighborhood, but in fact it was actually one of the highest self-reported victimizations that residents that responded to the survey reported. And so taking that information, going another step further back to the data analysis component, we uncovered with more fine-grained analyses that about 41% of all burglaries that are occurring over about an 18-month period in a particular neighborhood referred to as Hyatt in that North Region were repeat burglaries, meaning it was the second, third, sometimes fourth and fifth time that an address had been hit by a burglary. And then we also demonstrated in those analyses that there was a near repeat burglary phenomenon where the greatest risk for neighbors of an initial burglary was in about a 500-foot proximity, about a city block in Columbia from that initial burglary, and within 1 to 7 days of that burglary happening. And so what do we do with that was the big question. We have this great data, and so we were tasked in the tactical coordinating group to sit down and look at the literature of some of the things that have been done in the past in the UK and then in the United States as well, some recent stuff that started, and developed more of a tiered approach to reducing burglaries. And Chula Vista actually mentioned some of this literature earlier. And so to go briefly through what that tiered response looked like with responding to repeat, near repeat, the responding officer to a burglary is tasked with conducting their initial, like they normally would, their incident report, the crime report, but they also were to conduct a security survey with the resident. And so what that did was essentially allow the officer to interact with the resident of the home and walk around the physical proximity of their home, within their home, identify problems that may exist that would precipitate a burglary victimization. For instance, untrimmed hedges, tools left outside that could be used, for forced entry, like a shovel or a garden rake or something like that. Essentially, to do a survey of the residents to help that individual see what they can help themselves reduce a repeat in the future. And then we had a pamphlet put together that outlined some tips to reduce your chances of burglary that we gave that resident. And then to tackle the near repeat phenomenon, a group of officers was tasked within 24 hours of that initial burglary. They had to canvass the 500-foot area surrounding that burglary address, and they had door hangers with burglary tips on them that they were to put on each of the addresses surrounding that 500-foot radius. And essentially it told those residents that there had been a recent burglary in your neighborhood, and that research demonstrates that you're at increased risk because of your proximity to this. And so it's to increase awareness within the community. And then the second component is a tiered approach. If a repeat burglary did occur, the officer would go do a follow-up security survey to see if that resident had done anything to help the situation to reduce their chances of victimization. And then at that point, the resident may actually qualify for a temporary security system to be installed to help them from being a victim a third time. So with respect to what happened during the grant period, we ended at the end of October, and we're finishing some of the analysis at this point for the final report. And so preliminary analysis showed that there was a reduction in overall burglaries within the grant zone, the initiative zone of Hyatt, but there also appears to be a significant decline in the region as a whole. And so what we're trying to disentangle now is to what extent the actual, the initiative had a statistically significant effect within that specific neighborhood. And then also we're in the process of disentangling the extent to which near repeat burglaries have declined to the extent that we can. And so the second project that developed out of those initial strategic coordinating group meetings was the fact that, there was a lack of gang intelligence within the Columbia Police Department. So it's a very small gang unit. And in fact, at the beginning of the grant, they had one officer assigned to their gang task force. Since then, they've gained officers, and they've actually merged with a local agency to try to share information and work together so as a joint gang unit, which is great. But with respect to the beginning of it, having such a small gang unit, you can't have a lot of time to sit there and collect data and analyze data when you have to be out on the street actually interacting with, real gang members. So it created a good opportunity for the agency to leverage the SPI grant in a more of an intel-led policing approach. And so what we did, working with the gang unit and other members in a more of a tactical coordinating group ad hoc setting, was some of our research partners used social network analysis to help proliferate the gang intelligence database. And so at the beginning of the grant period, the database that they had consisted of individual PowerPoint files of gang members. And so they had, as much as they could, they had gathered as much intelligence on specific gang members known within the jurisdiction, but to have them in individual PowerPoint files, as you can imagine, is not really conducive to data analysis. And so it was largely useless from an investigative standpoint to help understand the gang problem and address some of the gang problems. And so using social network analysis has allowed us, over the past about 12 months to significantly increase the number of verified gang members, and then even maybe more importantly, known associates and subgroups within the jurisdiction. And so what this has done is allow the gang investigators an ability to analyze a database as opposed to having a stack of PowerPoint presentations. And so use that to analyze the database in a smart and useful manner. And so where we are now is attempting to move that database into a more accessible and usable on an everyday basis standpoint for those individual gang officers, so they can, over the next 6 to 12 months, really harness the power that database has. And so to wrap up some of what Kevin says, I think the foundation for the UK National Intelligence Model has been laid in Columbia, but by no means has the agency implemented the model in full, and I don't think we had any illusions that we would at the beginning of the grant. However, there has been significant organizational change in the direction of making intelligence-led policing a more common fixture within the agency. And so the question that arises is, what have we learned to this point? Is the National Intelligence Model, in our experience and our perception, worth replicating? And I think the simple answer to that is yes. It is worth replicating, but it's really difficult to do so depending on where your agency is in the standpoint of integrating data and analysis into its everyday activities. But it's a great model, a great aspirational model. to use and to use as a guidepost for agencies that are looking towards some type of model to go to from an intelligence-led policing framework. And so it essentially gives agencies a clear best practices, something to look up to, and then that model can, the organizational model itself can be tailored to the specific jurisdiction and the needs or problems within that agency in the city that it has jurisdiction over. And so, thank you.
Any questions for Scott from Columbia? All right, then I'm going to hand things back to Julie Wartell to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you. And so, in summary, we have heard about a variety of policing models and strategies that have been adopted through various Smart Policing Initiative grants. Homicide investigations in Boston, the graded response to domestic violence in Chula Vista, California, and the National Intelligence Model, both organizationally and on specific projects. Philadelphia really being more inspired instead of adopting exactly by the model to change a lot of the analysis organizationally. And we heard from Columbia, who worked on specific projects with the hopes of eventually changing organizationally as well. So to wrap up, more evidence of the UK's strength in forward-thinking, effective policing and problem-solving is their success on the annual Herman Goldstein Award. So this award recognizes innovative and effective problem-oriented policing projects that have achieved measurable success in resolving recurring specific crime, disorder, or public safety problems faced by the police and the community. It's actually been won 7 times and a finalist 13 times by a UK police force. Also, last year, the Norfolk Constabulary implemented evidence-based problem solving, which provides funding to assist officers with the responses on their problem-solving efforts. This model is currently being evaluated, but it does show how a chief constable values data-driven, evidence-based policing for crime reduction and prevention. The SPI sites described today are not only a testament to what we can learn from across the pond, but how we can adapt these models for success in jurisdictions large and small in the United States. So as my last slide for the webinar are just some references, the Peel's Principles, a journal article about that and the history of that, the article that Deborah Weissel mentioned that talks about the West Yorkshire approach, an article about the National Intelligence Model in the UK. Herman Goldstein winners can be found on the Pop Center website, and then the article that is related to this webinar that's on the Smart Policing website. So if there are any generic or general questions or any specific questions for the other presenters, just holler.
Hi, Julie. It's Brenda Bond.
Hi, Brenda.
So I don't want to take up too much time because I could be standing between something else, but I would be interested, a couple of people in the presentations made comments about resistance or adoption of different models. I guess I would just be interested in any general comments from folks about what has worked in convincing people inside the organization that a model from another country would, or even another structure, police organizational structure, would apply. And I just am curious as to sort of whether that was appealing to people or if people received additional or more resistance than normal because it wasn't sort of a quote-unquote American type of approach.
I think that's a great question, and I'm going to put that out to the presenters. Does anyone have anything specific? I know in Boston, at least, they got a trip over the pond, so they probably were welcoming it.
Sure.
Only half curious.
Yes.
But
Brenda,
if anyone has any, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we obviously, a lot of the pushback between us and between the UK model and Boston Police had to do with the types of crimes that occur over in the UK. And we really try to hone in on the fact of the process and the structure and leaned a little further away from the actual types of crimes. They have a lot of stabbings and a lot of domestic homicides over there, so most of our homicides are gun assaults and gang related, so finding the similarities between that was difficult, but just explaining the process and, some of the benefits resource-wise, forensically, and documentation-wise is kind of what we focused on versus the comparative between the two on just the actual crimes themselves.
Thanks, Desiree.
Anyone else have any experience with that, positive or negative?
Yeah, this is Scott from Columbia. I would add that, I don't know if we didn't really face much resistance, at least it was told the research partners, because it was a different country. In fact, it almost seemed like referring to it as the UK national intelligence model lended legitimacy to the approach. And so, and I don't think any of us would take credit for that. I mean, we didn't. It almost worked for itself just by name and lending legitimacy right from the get-go. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, it just, there's always so much resistance to change. I don't want to generalize too much, but I just am curious about, like as you said, is that more appealing because it sounds like, oh, they must be much more sophisticated than us, or is it less appealing because people think, well, how could that apply to us given the differences? So just curiosity, really.
Yeah, I think I'd follow up with, I don't want to give the wrong impression that we didn't face resistance at all. I think not much resistance from the get-go of trying to adopt the model, but once you get to the nitty-gritty of actual, intelligence-led policing, and that's where we actually saw some resistance that you have to fight through. But from the standpoint of the organizational model itself, no.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions
or comments? Oh.
Great minds, Julie.
Yes.
All right, then I think Chip Coldren has a couple closing remarks, and then we will sign off. Chip?
Very good, very good. Thank you, Julie, very much. Thank you to our presenters and Zoe and the folks at CNA who will always work in the background to make these things happen. We hope that you found that there was something useful and interesting in these presentations. If you did or did not, please let us know in the evaluation that you'll receive shortly. And I just appreciate everybody's time, including the participants and the questions that were asked. Thanks very much to everybody, and take care.
Thank you.